5 teenagers stood together on the Dodge Road overpass in Genesee County, Michigan, as cars moved steadily along the interstate below. It was the evening of October 18, 2017, and they were restless. Their ages ranged from 15 to 17, boys who should have been in school or at home but instead had wandered into mischief. From their position above Interstate 75, they could see traffic streaming north and south, headlights tracing ribbons of light into the distance. They had come prepared with ammunition. Rocks and chunks of concrete had been collected from nearby, along with tires and scraps of metal. The idea was simple in their minds: drop heavy objects onto the freeway and watch what happens. As the first pieces of debris tumbled, they leaned over the railing, grinning as cars swerved or jolted under the impact. Glass cracked, metal dented with each collision, only encouraging them more. After they threw the objects, they would watch for hits. If a car was struck, they'd hurry off so the drivers below wouldn't catch sight of them. As the group continued their game, one of them, 17-year-old Kyle Anger, went further. He hefted a jagged rock weighing nearly 20 pounds. The others watched as he swung it up to the edge and released. The stone dropped fast, gaining speed with every foot it fell. Below, a van was moving northbound. In the passenger seat sat 32-year-old Kenneth White, returning home from a day at work. Beside him, a coworker drove steadily through the evening traffic. Neither man had time to react. The rock punched through the windshield with explosive force. Glass shattered into hundreds of shards, spraying across the cabin like shrapnel. The driver was blinded, his skin cut, and his clothes peppered with fragments. For Kenneth, the impact was direct. The boulder-sized rock slammed onto his face and chest with devastating force, throwing his body back into the seat. The van veered as the driver struggled for control, covered in blood and glass. He somehow managed to steer to the shoulder, hard racing, but what he had saw beside him was beyond comprehension. Kenneth was slumped, his face mangled and swelling rapidly. Blood streamed from his mouth and wounds pulling across the dashboard. The rock was jagged and wet where it had landed. Other drivers who had pulled over rushed to help, but the sight inside the van was shocking. One witness later described Kenneth as unrecognizable, his features destroyed by the impact. Emergency responders were called immediately. When paramedics arrived, the interior of the van looked like the aftermath of an explosion. The windshield was obliterated, blood sprayed across the interior, and Kenneth was motionless. Yet, he was not entirely gone. Faint movements and shallow breaths were noted, and it's even stated some bystanders reported hearing him moan softly. He was rushed to the Hurley Medical Center, but the extent of his injuries were already overwhelming. Trauma surgeons attempted resuscitation, fighting against catastrophic internal damage, but the autopsy would later describe his condition in detail. His skin had been fractured in multiple places. His jaw was shattered, the orbital bones surrounding his eyes had collapsed, leaving his face broken beyond recognition. His ribs were snapped and splintered, puncturing a limb, which collapsed. Blood filled his airway and chest cavity, with a massive hemothorax that suffocated him from the inside. His sternum was broken and his heart bruised, and vessels were ruptured. Doctors testified that even with the best trauma care, survival was merely impossible. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head and chest due to a rock through a windshield. The manner of death: homicide. Back at the Dodge Road overpass, police quickly pieced together what had happened. Debris littered the roadway, and witnesses reported seeing shadows on the bridge. Within days, all 5 teenagers were identified and arrested: Kyle Anger, along with Mark Seliski, McCaden Payne, Trevor Gray, and Alexander Miller. Prosecutors announced charges of second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. In court, the forensic evidence was presented in stark detail. Jurors saw photographs of the van's obliterated windshield with its interior drenched in blood. They were shown the rock itself, still streaked with tissue. Doctors explained how a rock dropped from that height struck with the force of a sledgehammer, or in some calculations, the kinetic energy of a bullet from a high-powered rifle. One investigator told the jury bluntly, the rock didn't just strike Kenneth, it exploded through him. The family sat through every moment. Kenneth's mother later described the unbearable moment of walking into the hospital and seeing her son lying on a gurney, his face broken, tubes protruding, and sheets soaked red. His fiancée sobbed as she explained to the court how she had to tell their little boy that his father was never coming home. The teenagers' defense teams argued their clients had not fully understood the consequences of their actions. Some of the boys expressed remorse, though many in the public felt their apologies rang hollow. Ultimately, Kyle Anger, who threw the fatal rock, accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. The others received lesser penalties, probation, community service, and in some cases, juvenile detention, for their roles in aiding and abetting. The case resonated far beyond Michigan. News outlets across the country reported it, and it was recorded in Wikipedia and discussed widely online. Drivers confessed they felt uneasy passing under bridges afterward, reminded that everyday routines can be shattered in an instant. For Kenneth White's family, the tragedy was deeply personal and lifelong. His son will grow up without his father, and his fiancée continues to carry the trauma of hospital corridors and broken promises. His parents live with the knowledge that their son's last moments were filled with violence and pain. The city of Rio de Janeiro is a place of contrast. Towering high-rises overlook sprawling favelas. Carnival parades and football matches bring joy, while at the same time, crime and violence cast long shadows. For decades, carjackings have been one of the darker realities of life in Rio. They happen so often that residents adopt habits. Doors locked at every stoplight, windows rolled up, and eyes scanning the mirrors for sudden movements. By 2007, these precautions were second nature to most families. On the evening of February 7, 2007, a 6-year-old Sao Helio Fernandez was in the back seat of his mother's car. He had spent the day like many boys his age, happy, carefree, and enjoying his childhood. That night, his mother, his sister, and a family friend drove through the Oswaldo Cruz neighborhood in Rio. Zao sat buckled into the seat, his seatbelt clipped across his lap. He was secure and safe in his mother's eyes, protected by the most ordinary of safety devices. Then, in a heartbeat, everything changed. A group of 5 young men, some barely older than teenagers, spotted the car. Armed and looking for a target, they surrounded the vehicle. In Rio, carjackings often unfold with terrifying speed. Drivers are dragged out, sometimes beaten, and sometimes shot. The criminals shoved Zao's mother out of the driver's seat, and in the chaos, they didn't bother to check the back. They didn't notice Zao, strapped in, too small to undo his seatbelt quickly. His sister scrambled out, terrified. The criminals slammed the door, jumped inside, and sped off into the night. What happened next defies comprehension. Zao's seatbelt had become twisted and snagged as he tried to get out. When the door shut, part of the belt looped outside the car, and as the vehicle accelerated, his small body was pulled out of the seat. Instead of falling free, he was dragged, tethered to the speeding car by the strap, and this car would not stop. For the next 7 kilometers, over 4 miles, the criminals tore through the streets of Rio, dragging the 6-year-old across pavement, gutters, and curbs. Witnesses later said they could hear the screams. Residents came out of their homes to the sound of tires screeching and a child's voice, shrill with terror and pain, echoing in the night. Zao's body slammed into obstacles, the ground metal posts, even parked cars. Skin tore away, bones shattered, and fingers and knees were ripped off against the pavement. His head struck repeatedly until it was crushed. Those who saw him described it as a nightmare. His body was reduced to a trail of blood and torn flesh, unrecognizable by the time the car finally stopped. What makes the horror so much worse is that he did not die instantly. People on the roadside, paralyzed by shock, reported him conscious during parts of the ordeal. They saw him flailing, heard his screams cut short, and watched in helpless disbelief as the car dragged him further and farther. Minutes stretched into an eternity, every second another blow against his small body. By the time he finally succumbed, the suffering he had endured was almost unimaginable. Alive, screaming, mutilated by piece by the unforgiving pavement of Rio. When the criminals finally realized what had happened, they abandoned the car and fled on foot. Zao's mutilated remains were left behind, still tangled in the seatbelt. The news of the crime spread across Brazil almost instantly. Television broadcasts and newspapers showed images of the abandoned car and described the brutal sequence of events. The country was shocked. Rio, a city already accustomed to violence, police recoiled at the details of what the 6-year-old had to endure. Vigils were held in his name, thousands marched in the streets carrying candles and calling for justice. His name became a rallying cry for a society demanding protection for its children. The judicial process moved quickly. The assailants were quickly identified, 5 young men, some minors under Brazilian law. The fact that one of the killers were under 18 ignited a national firestorm. Under Brazil's statutes, minors could not be tried as adults, no matter the crime. The idea that a boy could be dragged to death for miles, with his body being destroyed while criminals laughed and kept driving, and yet the perpetrators might only serve a few years in detention, outraged the public. Citizens called for reforms to Brazil's laws on juvenile crime. In court, the details were laid bare. Forensic experts testified about the extent of Zeo's injuries. Loss of limbs, shredded flesh, skull fractures, and catastrophic trauma incompatible with life. The seatbelt strap, examined in evidence, showed how it had blocked tight, preventing his escape. Judges and attorneys struggled to maintain composure. Killers were eventually convicted, though the sentencing varied because of their ages. The adults received prison terms. The younger offenders, including the minor, were sentenced to detention and youth facilities, meaning they one day could walk free. For Zeo's family, no punishment could balance the scales. His mother lived with the image of her child being torn from the car, in his final moments spent screaming on the streets. His sister carried survivor's guilt, haunted by the night she climbed out while her brother remained strapped inside. The streets where he was dragged or washed and cleaned, and the blood scrubbed away. In Central Florida, the summer air in July presses down heavy and hot, the kind of heat that hums with insects and leaves sweat clinging to the skin. In the small community of Highway Park near Lake Placid, life moved quickly. Families lived in modest homes with yards running against patches of woodland. Cars rumbled along the back roads and dogs barked in the distance, their voices carrying across the humid evening. People there were used to the rhythms of rural Florida, where space was wide and neighbors knew one another, where the woods at the edge of town gave both shelter and a sense of unease. Stray animals wandered freely, sometimes tolerated, sometimes avoided, depending on how bold they became. On the afternoon of July 4th, 2019, 45-year-old Melvin Olds Jr. walked through one of those wooded areas behind a home. It was a holiday that day, and as fireworks cracked elsewhere across the state, Melvin moved along the shaded path, surrounded by the tall grass and trees that swayed only slightly in the still, humid air. Now, it's not known why he did this. He probably just wanted to go for a walk, but it was there, away from the roads and the houses, that he encountered the animals. There were not just 1 or 2 strays out wandering for food or water. There were several moving together, acting as a unit. There were dogs, and packs of dogs behave differently than individuals. Alone, hesitation remains, but in a group, the drive to chase, surround, and dominate becomes stronger. Their instincts sharpened in numbers, and the fear of approaching a human overshadowed by the confidence of the pack. And these dogs were very confident and really violent. The first bites were not the end, but the beginning. This was not an attack that stopped quickly. It unfolded in waves, the dogs circling, lunging, and tearing, and retreating only to come again. When rescuers later examined Melvin's body, they counted more than 100 bite wounds. The sheer number spoke of the ordeal's length. Every few seconds brought another set of teeth, another rip of flesh, and another joint of pain. The attack was not swift or merciful, it was sustained and unrelenting. Although he tried to fight, the evidence of his struggle was written on his body. Deep puncture wounds marked his forearms and hands, where he had lifted to block the snapping jaws. But with each passing movement, blood loss increased, weakness grew, and the odds of survival shrank. Even a strong, healthy man could not withstand 5 or 6 dogs clamped down at once, each bite stripping away more strength. Now, someone must have heard his screams because the paramedics would arrive. But by the time they did reach him, there was nothing to be done. The ground around him was stained with the blood he had lost. His clothing was shredded, soaked through, no longer protecting him, but clinging in tatters to a body ravaged by the attack. The medical examiner who later reviewed the case confirmed what the scene already suggested. He had died from blood loss and shock brought on by the sheer number of wounds. Over 100 separate injuries covered him, some shallow tears, but others gouges deep into muscle, some clustered on his arms and legs, others tearing into his torso and even around his neck and head. Each one on its own might have been survivable, but together they formed a pattern of trauma nobody could endure. The details of the autopsy added even more horror to what had already been uncovered. More than half of the bite marks showed signs of tearing, evidence that the dogs had not simply bitten down, but had shaken their heads violently, ripping skin and muscle away in chunks. Some wounds overlapped, as if more than one dog had latched onto the same place at once. Investigators described the injuries as extensive and brutal, noting that his body bore the signs of a prolonged fight rather than an instant death. Authorities would act quickly. 6 dogs were captured in the days that were followed. They were described as pit bull mixes, roaming unsupervised in the area. DNA testing was ordered to determine whether they were the ones responsible, though the size and shape of the bite marks already appeared to match. Regardless of the results, their fates were sealed. Animals implicated in fatal maulings are almost always killed, but investigators wanted certainty. For the record, for the family, and for the community that needed answers, which it turned out they were, and after finding that out, they weren't killed. The broader context of the case pointed to a problem that had plagued Florida for years. Rural counties with large expanses of unfenced land and limited animal control resources often see packs form when unneutered and unwanted dogs are abandoned. Once a group establishes itself, they no longer behave like pets. They hunt livestock, they scavenge, and in rare but catastrophic instances, they turn on people. Even though these attacks are uncommon, when they happen, they expose the fragile line between domesticated animal and predator. Star Lake, Putnam County, Florida is ringed with docks and modest lakeside homes, where families often spend weekends fishing, swimming, and pulling children on tubes behind boats or jet skis. On summer afternoons, the water hums with engines and echoes with laughter, a scene that feels routine in a community where recreational boating is part of everyday life. On one such afternoon in 2025, 3 children climbed onto a large inflatable tube tethered to a jet ski. They strapped on life vests, gripped the handles, and prepared for an ordinary ride across the water. The operator of the jet ski was a man in his 70s. He was experienced enough to guide the craft and likely thought of little risk as he pulled away from shore. The tube skimmed across the surface, bouncing in the wake as the children shouted and clung to their grips. To anyone watching from the nearby homes or docks, it looked no different from countless other tubing sessions on Florida lakes. The speed was moderate and the water was relatively calm, and the children appeared secure in their gear. Yet tubing carries a hidden danger in the way the tow line handles momentum. When a watercraft turns, the tube behind it does not pivot neatly. Instead, it swings outward in a wide arc, gaining extra speed. The tighter and faster the turn, the harder the tube whips across the surface. Experienced operators know to keep turns gradual and away from fixed structures. But on Star Lake that day, the turn was sharp and the dock that jutted from the shoreline was too close. The tube carrying all 3 children hurtled toward it, and that collision was violent. The inflatable slammed into the deck with full force, with the impact amplified by the speed of the swing. For the children strapped in life vests, there was no chance to shield themselves. Their small bodies were driven into the hard structure, bones and organs absorbing energy that the tube itself could not cushion. The sound of the crash startled neighbors, who turned to see chaos erupt where moments before there had only been play. Those who rushed forward found a scene of devastation. 9-year-old Andrew Botch had taken the brunt of the impact. His body was broken and his injuries were catastrophic. He was unresponsive when pulled from the wreckage, bleeding heavily, with his face and torso bearing the marks of blunt force trauma. His 10-year-old brother was also injured, crying out in pain but still conscious. 11-year-old Kaylin Bass suffered serious wounds that would require extended hospitalization at UF Health Shands. All 3 had been wearing life vests, but the safety gear offered no protection against the crushing blow of wood and speed. First responders were called to Star Lake and arrived quickly, but for Andrew there was little they could do. The trauma he had sustained was beyond belief. The trauma he had sustained was beyond emergency medicine could repair. Life vests are designed to keep children afloat and prevent drowning, but they can't stop ribs from snapping, skulls from fracturing, or organs from rupturing when bodies collide with immovable structures at high velocity. Investigators later confirmed that his death was the direct result of blunt force trauma from the collision. The authorities from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission Commission opened an investigation into the crash. Their findings confirmed the sequence of events. The tube had been pulled into a turn too close to a dock. The swing had carried it into the structure, and the impact caused fatal and serious injuries. The operator of the jet ski, though uninjured, became the focus of scrutiny. At his age, he may have had the experience, but the judgment, a sharp turn, near a fixed object, was questioned by officials and community members alike. Understanding the mechanics of what happened helps explain the scale of the tragedy. When a tube swings behind a tow vehicle, its speeds can nearly double compared to that of the craft itself. A jet ski traveling 20 miles per hour may send its tube whipping across the surface at 30 or more. A collision at that velocity generates forces comparable to a car crash, but without seatbelts, airbags, or helmets. The only barrier between flesh and dock that day was the thin nylon and vinyl skin of the inflatable, which did nothing to slow the impact. Kalon Bass remained hospitalized for weeks, recovering from injuries that were not fully detailed in official releases, but were described as serious. The 10-year-old brother was treated and released. Both surviving boys faced not only physical healing, but the psychological burden of having lived through the accident. Survivors of such traumatic events often experience flashbacks, anxiety around water, and lasting fear that can take years of counseling to address. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission has yet to announce where the criminal charges will be filed, but investigations into boating deaths often raise the question of negligence. If an operator fails to exercise reasonable care, such as by steering too close to docks, turning too sharply, or endangering passengers, they can face legal consequences. Civil lawsuits are also common in such cases, as families seek accountability and compensation for their losses. For Andrew's family, the loss was immediate and irreparable. One son was dead, another was injured, and a family friend was in the hospital with severe wounds.
And now, folks, it's time to say goodnight. We sincerely appreciate your patronage and hope we've succeeded in bringing you an enjoyable evening of entertainment. Please drive home carefully and come back again soon. Good night.